अंतर्राष्ट्रीय महिला दिवस की सभी को शुभकामनाएं। मैं डॉक्टर बिमला पवार, फिजिकल एजुकेशन एंड स्पोर्ट्स साइंसेज डिपार्टमेंट
Science over here, and then my best wishes on the Women's International Day.
Good morning, everybody. I am Nidhi Arora from Department of Computer Science, Cleanliness College. I am assistant professor over there, and a very happy Women's Day to all. Thank you.
Moral College. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Commerce, and I'm also heading the placement cell of the college. Thank you.
Good morning. A very happy International Women's Day to all. I am Dr. Aman Hashmi from Trivedi, Pragati Bihar. I am PGT of English as well as the teacher counselor of this school. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Myself, Preeti Singh from Kendriya Vidyalaya Pragati Bihar. I am a teacher over there, and wish you all a very, very happy Women's Day. Thank you.
A very good morning to all. I'm Mamta Mishra. I'm a TGT English in Kendriya Vidyalaya Pragati Bihar.
Yoga teacher, KB and
Good morning to one and all. Myself. I thought it was going to be simple. I picked up the story on Raju the elephant. You cried. Remember that incident when he was liberated by SOS Wildlife, I believe in Lucknow, and a midnight raid, and they brought that elephant out of chains. He had been chained for 48 years. And the elephant cried upon his liberation. And the veterinarians interpreted that as joy. Those were tears of joy. I wonder how you know an elephant's emotions and an elephant's mind, you know, what kind of tears those were. But anyway, they were considered tears of joy. And I thought I would do a little book about how we treat and mistreat animals. And then it became a bigger and bigger book, and I realized I really don't know all that much about animals. A little bit through experience. I come from the United States, the western part, so I've been in contact with wildlife. But I wasn't aware that we have a service for the U.S. government which literally annihilates wild animals by the millions in order to protect the animals who are owned by farmers and ranchers. That agency is called the Wildlife Service, and it's considered a rogue agency. And like I say, they might kill upwards of 3 million wild animals per year. And I've seen a cougar, you know, similar to one of your felines, you know, a leopard and a tiger. Mountain lion, I've seen it in New Mexico at night on a snowy road, and I'll never forget that image of that cougar. And I won't forget the fact that then the Wildlife Service came out the next day with their trappers and hunters and marksmen and went to kill it. What I've learned about animals is considerable in the last year, and I think I have written a book, but I have to improve the book in many respects. I've published 6 books in India, and I was on my way up from Mumbai, from Bombay, actually made my first trip to India in 1993. And I came into Mumbai on the night of 6-7 January 93. So everybody knows what was happening in Mumbai on that night, right? Riots. Riots had started. And I had met Amitav Ghosh, the Bengali novelist. Met him in France. My first book was published in France. And I'm a former university teacher in France, and I'm a citizen of France. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I did to support some Indian women who wanted some experience in France. And that'll be my basic contribution. But before I do that, I would just like to mention a few things about these animals. Okay, but I showed up in India, and I admitted to myself I did not know much about India. And I kind of felt, okay, I am deliberately ignorant. You know, it's an easy way out. It's intellectually say, well, I just don't know, you know. And a lot of times we would like to pretend that we know a lot more than we really do. But Amitav Ghosh in France took a look at my first book in French, and we had the same publisher, a prestigious publisher in Paris, and my book had done quite well with a lot of press, a lot of very positive articles, maybe 30-some articles. I did conferences in Paris and radio with Belgian radio, and everything was happening except nobody elsewhere in the world wanted to publish my book. And I showed it to Amitav Ghosh, and he took a look at it. He said, well, you know, interesting book. It's about an American officer. Yeah, I was an officer and in the U.S. Air Force. Yeah, about nuclear weapons. Yeah, I was in the control systems for nuclear weapons. And yeah, psychiatric hospital and madness. Yeah, yeah, I was incarcerated. I use the term very deliberately, and there are psychologists here who should recognize what I'm saying. Incarcerated in a psychiatric ward for 6 months by the U.S. government, in Washington, mainly in Washington, D.C. And he says, but, you know, okay, interesting book. I'll put you in contact. I'll tell you which publishers. What was happening is that I had a book published in French and Greek and Italian, but not in my own country, not in England, and not in Germany, not in Spain. And the book was disappearing. And so I wanted to come to India and look for an English language publisher. And he said, but you know, the truth is, Indians would probably rather read about themselves. And so I showed up in Mumbai, and on the very first morning in India, I started writing about the Mumbai riots, the Bombay riots. And I had the first manuscript on the Bombay riots, and I brought it up to Delhi, and I showed it to Rupa, HarperCollins, and they said, we're going to publish it. And they did, and I came back for the release, and while I was in Delhi, the publisher said, I wanted to go to the Kolkata Book Fair, you know, one of the major book fairs in the world. I wanted to go to Kolkata, and the publisher said, you can't go until you have positive press on this book. This book is going to get us in a lot of trouble. And well, if you get involved, promoting this book and going to the World Book Fair, we'll have to mount a guard at the publishing house. You know, this is the publishing house which did Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, you know, and so they know what they're talking about. And so the Hindu did a really positive article on my book, and I was meeting other publications, and I saw the announcement for a meeting in IIC on environment. And I showed up, and this fellow came up to me and he said, who are you? What are you doing here? And I said who I was, and he said, you're conducting the session today. And I've known Dr. Trivedi since that moment, and he's always been a wonderful host for me, and I've collaborated with him over a number of years, and I've attended many functions in IIC, and at one point we tried to come up with figures on how many people have attended your functions. And we were up around 80,000, no? Yeah, so you can think that, you know, Dr. Trivedi is like a plaque tournant, you know, a turning point, like a clearinghouse for many of the people involved in environmental issues, and which I am. I've done my doctoral studies in Paris in the very first world seminar in the world on sustainable development, and I was a water quality planner for the state of New Mexico, and a few other things. But back to animals. I'm going to have to read this. It's about males and females, birds. And what happened here earlier is that outside the window of the room where I stay at his institute, there's a jungle. And I record bird song just outside my window, and I've got about 60 recordings on here. And so what about bird song? How does that relate to International Women's Day? This is how. There's research being done on many birds, including the finch. Young males in the family of this feathered crooner, crooner means singer, learn the song of their father, perfect it, and perform it as adults to attract a lifelong mate. Their song is loud, elaborate, and precise, With their songs they say, chirp, chirp, my brain is healthy and my body is strong. That's something you're into, right? That's communicating to the female finch. The female finch also learns the songs of her father from a young age, but she does not perform. She's the critic. She analyzes every detail of a potential mate's song, compares it to her father's example, and decides if this performer is one she'd like to keep around. If she detects a song is too simple or off in any way, she'll have nothing to do with its performer. She's very picky, and she should be, because the mate she chooses will help raise their young till death do them part. That's all I'll say about animals. You have to wait and read my book, and it's going to be called probably Animal Wars. But maybe not, because do we have to insist on the word war? You know, there's an expert on elephants in India, and he did an interview in an Indian magazine, and he said he wants to drop the term conflict. Okay, you know, you read often about, just last week, the director of a tiger reserve in South India was trampled to death by an elephant. And people get into conflict with the animals, and he doesn't even like the term conflict. He likes the term interrelations or exchanges or relationship. But I'm not so sure that we have not waged wars against animals. And it could go back to prehistoric times when we were the prey for predatory animals. And then somehow we turned the tables and we became the predator on the animals who up till now are our prey. So I'll ask you a tricky question, a trivia question. 3 major species on the planet devour more meat than any others. Which are they? Which are the 3? Can you imagine? Homo sapiens is on top of the list. Yeah, we're the meat eaters par excellence. And anybody else? A huge animal in the seas, the whale, and a very tiny animal in the canopies of the jungles and the trees and on the ground, the spider. So there are 25 million tons of spiders in the world, 25 million tons of spiders, and they eat around 400 million tons of meat every year, something like we do. Spiders and human beings eat about the same amount of carcasses. Okay? With respect to Indian women, my family in France sponsored 3. 1993, I was in the Bombay riots, and I was at a lawn tennis club, and a young girl came up to me and said, I want to go, you're American, aren't you? And I want to go to the US and play tennis. I said, well, that's fine, but I live in France. And I said, why didn't you come to France? And she did. 16-year-old girl. She was one of India's best tennis players at the time, and she came to France, and she and I did some doubles together, and then she did some doubles with a very good women player in my town. She won a tournament,